Welcome, greetings. It's lovely to see you again. And for those of you joining us for the first time or listening in on video, this is a Chesapeake Forum lifelong learning class called Me, Myself, and I Narrators, Exploring Identity in Short Fiction. And we use I like short fiction because it gives us the opportunity to sample many different authors and voices and explorations of common themes of interest. Last week, we started out with names. We introduced ourselves and shared a little bit, some thoughts about our names, and read a story by Cisneros about the little girl who did not appreciate having her ancestor's name, a great-grandmother named Esperanza, Hope. The irony was not lost on her because she understood this grandmother of hers lived in a rather hopeless situation. And yet another take on names took us to India, where the British colonial teacher wanted to impose English names on the little girls. Premila, don't you think Pamela is a much nicer name? Isn't Cynthia better than Santa? And then you realize, well, it's a different story when someone is taking your name and imposing. And then quite a different take when we went back to the Garden of Eden, where this naming business all started, and we read this little allegory of revolution where Eve says, look, whoever names has control. We are going to throw this off and unname everyone, and they can choose or not choose whatever they want to be named. So anyway, before we get started, if again, those of you who are watching will see that we're very informal here. And part of the idea is, I think, well, you're all very good, careful readers, but good readers can become even better readers by sharing their thoughts on what they've read. I am just going to invite Dodie, who's joining us today, if you would like to introduce yourself or comment on how Doris becomes Dodie, that would be interesting.
Yeah, I did all the reading and I did listen into the recording, so I feel like I know you a little bit. I'm named after my mom, so she was Doris, and I guess my middle name Patricia, I don't know where that came from other than my mother liked it. And my brother was born 3 years later and he couldn't say Doris. So what he said sounded like Dodie, and the family thought that was a good idea since, you know, I was baby Doris, but, you know, I was growing up, so I was no longer baby Doris. So Dodie got to be my nickname, and quite frankly, I liked it for some reason. And maybe just because it differentiated me from my mother, I don't know. I just like the name. Now, what I found interesting in the reading about, you know, having two names, you know, the Indian girls, was that the name Doris was what they called me in school, and Dodie was what I was called at home. And even as an adult now, my friends call me Dodie. But at 5th grade, I had a teacher who referred to me as Doris, and I hated the way she said the name. And so after that, I just didn't like the name Doris anymore. And then, so I was primarily Dodie, and through high school and college, I was pretty much Dodie. You know, I would sign Doris, but everybody called me Dodie. And then I had a job as an adult, and my boss said to the HR person, but do I have to call her Dodie? And I really wanted this job. So I said, you could call me Hortense, it doesn't matter. And so, and those years I was called Doris again. And so there was the formal Doris who got dressed up and went to work. And then there was Dodie, the mom, you know, the friend. And I had a glimpse of that dual identity and how you see yourself in the different roles. So I thought that was sort of interesting. Well, that's my story.
It's a great story, and it's a good lead-in for today's story, which all the stories really are about role playing. And I think maybe we all play different roles, but sometimes in less drastic circumstances than the characters in these stories. I wanted to start out with first with the Alice Dunbar Nelson story, written about 100 years ago, and then we'll jump forward to a contemporary writer, since these two stories, The Stones of the Village and Local Hero, do have similar themes, well, connected themes. And then we'll go to the Jan Webster story, Abercrombie's Aunt. Alice Dunbar Nelson, her name itself, and here's a name issue we all deal with, women anyway, taking on our husbands' names, that Alice Dunbar Nelson was originally Alice Moore. The Dunbar came from her first husband, Paul Laurence Dunbar. I know there are poetry lovers here. If any of you know anything about Paul Laurence Dunbar, he was latter part of the 19th century, died early in the 20th. And he is most famous. Well, he wrote several poems. He was the son of parents who had been enslaved, but he himself was born after the Civil War and Emancipation. So many of his poems deal with the enslaved condition of people. In fact, one of his most famous lines, "I know why the caged bird sings," was adopted by Maya Angelou as the title of her memoir. So that's how a lot of people connect with Paul Laurence Dunbar, her, I would say, Alice's first husband. But there was one other poem that Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote that I thought might be even more relevant to today's. It has to do with masks, and it's a poem entitled "We Wear the Mask." And it goes, "We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides the cheeks and shades the eyes." So I thought, well, that kind of works for where we're going. But just a little bit of background on Alice Dunbar, and then the Nelson is her third husband's name. So she kept two husbands' names and didn't keep the middle one. Anyway, she was, 1875 and 35, in 1935. She was she went to Dillard College, it was called Straight University at the time, and graduated in 1892 at the time when fewer than 1% of Americans, any Americans, regardless of color, had gone to college or gotten university degrees. So she was very, very precocious, fought her way into a career in journalism, and was writing prolifically, and eventually became a civil rights activist. And along with her third husband, they fought hard to advocate for the passage of the Dyer anti-lynching bill, which was introduced by a white Republican representative in 1918. And I was reading a little bit about that because it was interesting to me. There have been several attempts. That bill was defeated, by the way. Oh, hi, Sarah. Welcome aboard. So glad to have you join us. Just giving a little bit of background here on Alice Dunbar Nelson, the first story we'll be looking at. Hi. And there have been several attempts, most of them introduced by the House of Representatives, but not passed by the Senate. And then more recently, a bill that came up in the Senate to make lynching a federal crime. But to this day, nothing has passed into law. There have been these various bills. And so anyway, Alice Dunbar Nelson was one who was fighting the fight long ago. That still continues. Other thing about her, Alice Dunbar Nelson, which is what else was I going to say? Oh yeah, she was. She's been associated with a movement they call the Harlem Renaissance, which was really a description of the flowering of art, music, literature, journalism in the 1920s and into the 30s in the US, a time when there were mass migrations of African American people from the South to escape the Jim Crow laws. And the advantage of coming into the cities throughout various cities in the US, but we think primarily of New York, that's given the label to the movement, the Harlem Renaissance. There are a lot of talented writers, but if you have a voice but can't get published, what do you do? So you make connections. And the connections they had were mutually reinforcing. They started publishing their own magazines and journals. And these got traction and eventually they were mainstreamed in the way that that Black music and art and other forms of cultural expression. So that is, you hear about the Harlem Renaissance, that really refers to a very exciting time in American culture. People were finding voices and platforms and cultures.
Langston Hughes, I think, was a name, and others from that era, I believe.
Yeah, he was one of the drivers. And they spoke there were journalists, as I said, and activists and painters and people who might just have been buried in rural communities where they didn't have a voice. So Alice Dunbar was a teacher, as well as an activist and lifelong writer. So, as I said, the story that we are looking at today, The Stones of the Village, was written more than 100 years ago, taking place, when do you think? Really?
Around the turn of the century, I think. Or no, post-Civil War, I guess I didn't pay attention.
Well, I don't
Late 19th century, perhaps, to early 20th.
I think it says here between 1900 and 1910.
That was when she wrote it. And I think, too, it was roughly contemporary, perhaps. As my thought, too, was post-Civil War, definitely, late 19th, early 20th, post-Emancipation Proclamation. But at a time when the southern states were starting to buckle down and throw off some of the gains, and they started to oppose some of the gains that had been let in during Reconstruction, where there was more freedom for Black people, and the resistance was pretty strong after Reconstruction. Anyway, Stones of the Village. What do we know about the character Victor Robert? I can say, what do we know? Because what does that character know about his own ancestry? When we were discussing the weight, the responsibility, and the pride of ancestry and the other stories. So I am kind of asking to speculate. What do you think his lineage was?
I think he was probably, his lineage may go back to Haiti, and he was part of the Creole caste, if you will, that dominated that area dominated is too strong a word, but that was prevalent in that area. I'm assuming he came from that diaspora.
I think very, very likely. Any other thoughts? Perhaps the French would be the clue. And then there were also Black Cajuns too. People who were, the Cajuns, that the French Oregon came down and settled, but there were intermixing. So I thought that the Haitians or the French connection, we really don't know. So
All I can ask is, he had a light skin, didn't he? So was he really a very mixed race person?
He was passing, obviously. He was passing for white.
Yeah.
But you know, I questioned about that because I went back and reread, and the only thing I could find about skin color, it said that he had become very pale from, staying in the bookstore and reading all the time. And
Yeah.
before that, I didn't think about it until much later in the reading. So I don't know. I was just assuming. It never occurred to me that he was passing until we started to read about him with his, the woman that became Emily, I think, who became his wife. And that's when I started to wonder, gee, is this guy passing as white? It wasn't clear. I had to kind of rummage around.
Well, that was the kind of surprise that she built up to, I think,
Mhm.
If you
Although
go-
I saw there was a clue earlier
Sure.
that caught my attention in the very early where he's out there playing with the little black and yellow boys.
Right.
And then his grandmother is so cruel, really, telling him he's different. And he says, some of the boys had faces that were white like his own.
Oh,
But then they ran him away, calling him a nigger.
But there, so in those early paragraphs, his grandmother notes there's something about his black curly hair. So you're getting some clues this way and that, but apparently that doesn't interfere with his passing, as they say.
I think, no, go ahead. I think as you and Mario have suggested, and Jody too, this is like a treasure hunt, or it's a path laden with hints and clues. But I think, along with us reading the story, you're trying to figure this out. The character himself is not aware that he knows he's not white. He knows he's not all white. And he's had to bear the brunt, as mixed race kids often do, of being harassed by both sides, the blacker kids and the whiter kids. So it can be a tough road to hoe there. But he goes and stays with, who is it, Madame Guichard, the friend of Grand-Mère, the lady who takes him in when he goes to the city to try to make it good. She is a Black lady. The first time I think that he realizes that he can pass, did anybody get, because I think he is just as clueless as we might be as we're reading along, getting different hints. But there's one time when it hits him.
And the lawyer suggests that he can go to college, his guardian, and go to this prep school and go to college, and he thinks I think that's when it dawns on him.
Yep, that's when it hits him. He says, "What?" And he almost says something. Huh? Tulane, by the way, did not desegregate until 1961. And that's when the first students, I think that's when they got together and drafted the desegregation policy. First Black students went in 1960. So this, way back when this story was taking place, to get into there, and then it hits. Oh, and he has almost that moment when, if he had said, "I can't get in there," it's like, oh, shut my mouth. And that's what starts this career.
Well, I think desegregation in Easton, at least in the schools, ended around the same time, I believe. I know that's an aside, but just to give you some perspective.
Mhm. Yeah. Perspective is very much appreciated because we can look at this and think, oh, well, the story was written 100 years ago, but it's not. There are very real connections about these laws. Even the miscegenation laws prevented a cousin of mine who wanted to get married to a lady of Japanese origin. And in 1964, they could not get married in Virginia. They had to come to Maryland and get married. So I think that's not, if I can remember it, I'm not going to consider it the distant past. Or how long of it. Okay. Well, when does this start getting to be a problem for this man? Why would it, when we get a hint that this is not going to be the easy path, like, I've got a role now and I can do what I want and marry whom I want?
Very, very late. My sense was I didn't get any hints until very late in the story, but maybe there were some clues earlier.
Well, I think when he's considering, should he marry his wife, and
Oh,
what
yeah.
if he finds out, I think that's when it becomes a crisis for him.
Well, I
Yes.
think remember that episode where he start to stand up for the Black person who's being, yes.
Mhm.
And then he says, "Look, I better not."
Mhm.
And he didn't. So, and then after that, he was very, as an adult, in his career, he was very antagonistic toward Black people.
To prove how white he was.
Exactly.
I
Sure.
think that,
Right.
Yeah, it's. Mhm.
But yes,
Go ahead.
yes. When he started thinking how this whole situation relates to this wonderful lady that he was courting, and how he was gonna be able to carry on and not reveal who he was and carry on with this relationship.
and justify himself. I think there's a lot of, should I really do this?
Yeah.
Is this okay? Just to himself, even, let alone to her enormous family. And don't you have a plantation somewhere? She asked.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, the thing that struck me was the brashness in thinking he could marry and have children. I mean, when I was in high school, I did a project for the science fair, and it was Mendel's beans. All the generations, and all of a sudden, boom, up would pop this, and I thought, wow, that's really brazen of him, because who knows what this baby's going to turn out to look like.
Yeah.
I was a little nervous at what I was reading. I thought, let's see what happens when they have the baby.
Yeah,
And
I was too.
the baby was born pale.
Yeah. But
Apparently.
a baby can never be darker than the darker parent. That, I think, even with Mendel's, and I read a lot of those.
Yeah. It would
Oh,
take
is that
few
right?
more generations.
This throwback thing is all urban legend.
Oh,
It's interesting, though. You really touch on something very interesting. Kate Chopin, who was associated with the New Orleans scene, earlier in the century, wrote, among other things, wrote a novel. I think it was The Awakening, that's very famous, feminist read, Story of an Hour. And another little short story is called Desiree's Baby. And in that story, the you know, his white upper class New Orleans family. The baby had some characteristics that suggested African heritage. And the husband was irate. He was sure his wife had been unfaithful, and he cast her and the baby out of the house. You leave and go into the wilderness despite this poor woman's protestation. And then he learns subsequently, I don't remember the plot details, that it's his own ancestry that had someone, an African American person in there. And here he had acted on his bias and thrown his wife and child out of the door. So these were very fraught issues. And as I think you're indicating, sometimes before the people thoroughly understood genetics, or one way someone explained to me that the bias was, you think of any Afro-American input, it's like a tiny drop of ink in a glass of water, and that was enough to quote unquote paint. So yeah, the marriage was the big thing, and how he managed to get beyond, because the other biases, their old families, even if he had been white, but without ancestors and property and reputation, how does he pull this off? It's a very daring thing to do. And then I think, as Dodie, you were pointing out, the chinks in the armor were where he thought he might have been letting down his guard, was really his most humanitarian instincts. Like there are people who share my racial characteristics who are being unfairly, treated and disenfranchised and not allowed to inherit property or find, anytime there's a judgment, it would always come down. But if you show any sympathy, he just felt all the more vulnerable. If he'd have been, So is this self-loathing or what?
Well, he was so enamored of this wonderful young lady that, along with other societal pressures, it kind of distorted. I could see it happening to anyone in that situation, wanting to hide what you were really about racially.
This also, it reminded me of, sometimes there are some very rich men who've made it big, who came from humble or very humble origins. And they are sometimes the most, what's the word? Anti-poor.
Disdainful.
I pulled myself up by my bootstraps.
Why can't you?
Why can't you? So, in other words, I'm going to distance. I don't identify. Well, it isn't the same thing. It isn't the same thing, but it reminded me of that.
Even reject. You reject your own
Reject your own past.
because you believe you've moved on to something better and a higher level.
Yeah, and you don't want to be tainted, held back, or tainted, or even identified with that older. Yeah, Elaine, I think that's an interesting parallel. In some cases, you want to put that behind you and not be identified with it. You're not proud of it. As you're reading the story, did you anticipate how it was going to turn out?
No.
Anybody? The optimist or the romantic? Maybe I was hoping that he would reveal it and his wife would still, oh, I love you just how you are, and it would be great. But I'm applying a present day mindset on the society that where people might have been less open.
Well, I really thought that when the lawyer, blurted out that you are, whatever he blurted out about his father, I thought at that point the whole story was going to change. and he was going to connect and come clean. And then he goes to meet this other lawyer, and I was kind of left hanging. Did they work out some kind of a deal?
I think so.
Well, this,
Tacitly.
yeah,
Mhm.
Yeah, and he was able, in that public setting where he was the judge, and excuse me for interrupting, he was able to create a humorous retort that seemed to put down the other, his antagonist for the moment. But then he goes back. What were you saying, Lynn?
Well, when he goes back to meet the lawyer
Oh,
in private, my question was, then what happened? Did they work out some kind of a deal to maybe he'll be a little nicer and
yeah, and the condition was by this smart, obviously black lawyer, you gotta make things swing my way now and then, more often.
That was sort of a surprise. Comes out that this black lawyer, obviously black lawyer, and I can't remember his name, is the nephew of the woman that he had, that our
Been
hero
staying with.
stayed with. Yeah. So, how did you know this? Well, yep. But he then keeps his silence. I don't think there was ever an agreement and a handshake, but just tacitly, he won't say anything further.
what was interesting to me
It was a good
was that,
bargain for the other lawyer, Pavageau, because he was now going to be able to anticipate that some arguments would go his way,
Better.
in the way of the lower caste, I will say.
Yeah.
And also, I think this guy Pavageau clearly understood the shoes that Grobert, that Victor was in. He was able to empathize on a level as well. And so he was going to keep his word and not say anything as long as Victor swung some arguments in the right direction.
exactly. I think two things. It's interesting that the crack in his armor, the chink in the armor, was from the nephew, but ironically, Pavageau said, well, my aunt spoke well of you. She was proud of you. Even though we know Victor didn't have anything else to do with her, she helped him. But once he was on track and passing, he left her way behind. But that was that one connection. But as you say, it was a tacit agreement. Pavageau was not a mean man. He was a kind, fair-minded, and he's saying, look, I'm not interested in outing you. If this were a film noir, he could have been blackmailing. But he did. He said, I don't even want you to, judge all cases in my favor. I just want it to be fair, which it isn't. I just want it to be open so that my people, your people, all people get a fair shake and not be, victimized by this mess. So you don't really know quite how this story is going to go, which is what I think. There are many, many possibilities, which makes it kind of interesting for the ambiguity. What about the very ending? Is this?
yeah.
That was a surprise. I didn't
No.
expect him to die on the doorstep.
Hard to say.
Uh-huh. He just could not speak.
Just assume he had a stroke. The
I
stress of it all. the stress, I guess if you're a rationalist, unless you want to believe there's an intervention there, that a supernatural intervention, you have to see that the stress this took eventually killed him. Anyway.
And it was some self-imposed stress. It wasn't stress that anybody outside him was applying. It was all from within.
Isn't that the worst kind?
Probably is. Can't get away.
And also in your theme of the class, Nancy, the word nigger. And towards the end, he goes, yes, I'm a nigger. Do you hear? A nigger, the name, that name nigger ends, you see that's his identity. I mean, that's one of his main names that he's trying to run away from. The worst thing that could ever happen to him is for someone to call him a nigger. And you can see this has been inside him always, that somebody would call him a nigger.
No, I think what you're saying relates to the title, the stones of the village. You know, we used to say sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me, but they do. And that word is the stone aimed at him that he was trying to dodge from all directions. Right. Well, thanks for that thought. That's a good one. Any more comments on this story, or before we jump into a contemporary? We take a moment to welcome Sarah joining us. Sarah, if I
apologize, I'm quiet. I got thoughts in mind, but I missed the meeting and hadn't done the reading, so I'm listening.
no. Well, you're welcome. And as I've said if there's anyone watching videos, tune in when you can, hear what other people have to say. I was tempted to greet you by saying Imi Sagoma. Ikakane.
Forgetting Barbara, I didn't speak so much Barbara, but thank you. I could do it I could do it in Eve.
Okay, great.
To the fact that both of us have quite a lot of time in Mali.
Yeah, and the degrees of separation. You know, I was reading about I saw that you'd been involved in these food programs and worked in Mali, and I mentioned to my husband, I said, "What's somebody who's done all that? What's she doing in Dorchester County?" And my husband says, "What are we doing in Dorchester?"
I'm working for a famine project virtually, so I'm still working with stuff in food security in Africa, but I do it virtually from here.
Okay, well, welcome to the group. Okay, going to Walter.
Actually, can I, before you switch, because I haven't read the whole story, but I've skimmed it now and listened to you and wanted to add a personal interpretation on one level, which is that I was married to somebody from Niger, an African. So our children are biracial and so pure African American, and that has been wonderful and an interesting challenge to raise kids who are not actually in this culture, because that's a different culture to be an African and an American. But it's also interesting how we're talking about passing. The passing has taken a different kind of dichotomy, in that one of my children is fascinated by Black culture and is very much into R&B and making beats and just dresses and walks and, recognizably Black American. And the other one has skedaddled off to Vermont and gone Burlington, and he does sailing and he wears jeans and he, there's an interesting tension between these two boys, which plays out in Victor's own life about what culture you're going to pick. And then who you're going to marry, because Victor goes and marries a white woman. As I have my one son who is dating very seriously a lovely girl from Maine who's white.
And the other one is much more, going with, he's not telling me about all his girlfriends because he's only 21. I was a little quiet on that, but I could see who he's dating. So it's just a fascinating thing as to when you have these different cultures in you, which ones, right? You speak to you or you want to move with. So that fight in him is very near to my heart, and it's not played out. I mean, it's not at all played out at this level of trauma or personal psychology in my children, but it is, and it's not passing, like no one's trying to pretend there's something they're not, but
Right.
they make choices. What they have now are choices, to be honest.
I
Wow.
really appreciate that. Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. Actually, it's a great segue into the next story we're going to be looking at by Walter Mosley. Cultures. We have many, many cultures and subcultures, and we can choose them. And sometimes we're born into a certain mindset, a culture, a way of life. And sometimes we rebel against it. And sometimes we just freely, as in your family, they can be happy operating in different ways. And so Walter Mosley, born in 1952, so relatively young author. You probably have heard about him. He's quite, maybe you've seen the movie The Devil in the Blue Dress, rather. He writes a lot of detective stories, crime novels, speculative fiction, plays, essays, TV and movie scripts. And he's created this character, a detective called E.Z. Rawlins, an unlicensed detective who solved crimes in Watts, LA. And he was this author is the first Black male to receive the National Book Foundation Medal for distinguished contribution to American literature. But talk about our mixed heritage. His mother is Jewish. Her ancestors immigrated from Russia, and his father's African American from Louisiana. And his story says that his parents tried to marry in 1951, and though the union was legal in California, no one would give them a marriage license. So anyway, he's had his, his family is fraught with, the issues, racism, and probably from various directions, the anti-Semitism as well. So when he was taking courses at City College at Harlem, and his mentor, one of his mentors was the writer Edna O'Brien, she encouraged him. She was encouraging Walter Mosley. She says, "You're Black, Jewish, with a poor upbringing. There are riches therein." So what she was telling him is, hey, you've got a lot there that you can mine for your fiction, which he has. And he still lives in New York City and identifies himself as both African American and Jewish. So let's get to these cultural choices, local hero. And we're not really away from names. This is also a story in which names play a role. It took me a while to sort out his family tree at the beginning with some of these interesting names. Were you able to sort out? Oh, you made a diagram. Bless you. I was thinking of doing that, but it's a little, you can split the screen, but I thought I would probably mess that up. So let's see, how are these two, Sherman and Stewart? Stewart is our protagonist. I'm sorry. Yes, Stewart is. And the cousin, they all share a common ancestor. They share, more than one ancestor. He talks about, and names are important. He talks about his grandpa, Theodore, who came to Flatbush. And then Theodore had 3 sons. I love these names: Isaac, Blood, and Skill. So why do you name kids this? And Then they all married, and he he believed himself to be the product of Skill, who married Mint Cardwell, whereas his cousin Sherman was the product of Blood and Nefertiti. Nefertiti became Titi. Titi is the, that kind of took me a second. Who's Titi? Oh, Nefertiti is the wife of Blood, who died a violent death, or like barroom brawlers. Does that help?
Mhm. And they're really double first cousins, if you want to look at this, because the three purported fathers are all brothers, and the three purported mothers, well, I guess they really are the mothers, are all sisters.
Sisters.
So they
Yeah.
are first cousins doubly.
Yeah, if you could increase that. And he makes a discovery that they're not only first cousins, but they're brothers, they're half brothers, because Blood, who got around before his violent death, was actually the father. He was having an affair with his own brother's wife that produced Stuart. That's a really close family, if you like. And then the other.
And the name Blood, Blood because he gets killed in a fight, Blood, and B, Blood because he's the blood that runs through the two protagonists, his blood.
And there's no references to these two supposedly cousins looking very much alike. And we get that repeatedly.
Yeah, we get it. Boy, you two look alike. So I says, does this story have a happy ending? I mean, if a story that involves somebody getting prematurely
Other than
killed.
people killed along the way, but he winds up assuming his brother's identity and going to college, which had not been obviously in his future previously. Apparently it never occurred to him to further his education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
But
yeah.
he does this in memory of his lost brother, cousin, whatever you want to call him.
Is this why does he do it? I guess that's what you say, in memory of. He's commemorating his brother, his brother, cousin.
Yeah, and now it makes me wonder if Sherman, who gets killed, knows about this background and knows who Stuart's father really is. Because he really takes Stuart under his wing, unlike there's two other brothers and a sister there, but only one of them we ever get a name. One of the brothers is Floyd. We never find the name of the other brother or the sister. But this is why I needed my diagram.
Yes, I understand. Yeah.
Well, I find the father is Skill. Is that not correct?
Skill.
Is Skill the father?
The one that turns out not to be the father, yes.
He's not really the father.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Skill is ironically.
Yeah, the purported father. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Who is referred to in almost the second paragraph, he refers to my mother's husband's Skill. Right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. They're getting a clue already. Why would he call my mother's husband? So that's for you clue finders. point. And they do have another cousin, Theodora, who's very sympathetic and makes the scene, in a, how can I say, in a fortuitous way when he's been taken down to the police office, that she's there to help him out.
Conveniently has got up there.
Yeah. There's something going on after the death. Well, actually, even before. Sherman has already been killed. And is it on the way back from the funeral that, no, it's later on, he's mugged. The steward is mugged.
Right.
And then you have a sense that he's being guided by Sherman. He said, how do you react in a situation when you're panic stricken? But he keeps his cool. And then when he's taken in by the police, you think the first thing you'd want to say was, this guy tried to mug me. He doesn't say a word, even when he's interrogated. What's going on there? Why doesn't he say anything?
To just go back a bit, in the beginning, he said, I learned so much from Sherman, especially after he died. And here it says, I pulled the trigger, pulled back the hammer, steadied my right hand with my left. This was something Sherman had taught me with a pistol he kept in the top drawer of his bureau. And there were things that led to the end of the story where it was because of Sherman having helped him in the past or taught him things in the past. So I don't know that I didn't get the feeling that Sherman was guiding him so much as he was drawing on what Sherman had taught him to get through the rest of his life. And I think it was perfectly natural for him to assume Sherman's identity, if that's where you're going with this. I mean, why not? He could,
Yeah, he tucks away all the advice that Sherman had given him. There's one interesting passage where he does run into this lady, the acquaintance of his, and he thinks he hears Sherman's voice. Oh yeah. It was at the funeral. A woman came up and said, "You look so much like him." A woman said, it was Natasha Koskov from Brighton Beach. It is interesting, add a Russian name from the author's own heritage. She was a breathless Russian with a long neck and lips like Mona Tremont, the first girl I ever kissed. That's what they say, I replied, wondering where the words and light tone in my voice had come from. How this young man is devastated. He doesn't want to talk to anybody. And all of a sudden, he finds himself in this conversation. "He loved you," she said, looking into my brown eyes with her black ones. "You want to get a drink?" I imagined Sherman asking. Yes. So he's starting to, I can't believe I'm saying this. I'm sounding more like Sherman. Sherman would not miss an opportunity to, have a good time with an interested woman. And it's not what he's inclined to do, and yet he is. So it's almost like as though he's incorporated, mentally, but emotionally, this element of Sherman, who loved life and wanted to experience even the danger. I want the thrill of danger. I want to find out what it's like to commit a robbery, to break the law sometimes, to go out with these, various women in situations where he might get into trouble. So what's going to happen? Has he given up here's the question, has he given up his own identity at the end by taking?
I think so. Back when he was meeting with Natasha, it says here, she called me Sherman. And after the first round, I didn't correct her. I was another man that night. She wasn't loving me, but Sherman, who could not be erased from the world or her heart or mine. And I think for him to pick up Sherman's identity was like a no-brainer. As he had, you know, he had the wallet, he had, I think, a sense of mission to continue, because Sherman was so great, to continue Sherman's life.
Well, and he says he had very low self-confidence. And by assuming Sherman's identity, he can now come across in the world as being much more confident and able and competent. Assuming Sherman's identity is his way to survive and be successful.
And I think share the love that he and Sherman had for each other. I think, why not just continue as Sherman? But whatever.
Is there any part of him, as you all say, the love is there, the admiration, and I think Elaine, you said is the young man Stewart's low self-esteem. He says, "Oh, we're nothing." Sherman is everything. He's the local hero. He's everybody's hero, and he refers to himself and his classmates as lumps of clay. He said, Sherman would grace us with his presence in the schoolyard. He'd come by, and the rest of us were just lumps. And that is sad in a way, too. What does he have? But I would say, I would ask this: has he erased all traces of himself in inhabiting Sherman's identity? Is Stewart gone? Stewart only the love for Sherman is the reflection of. I think there's one.
I think he didn't like himself. He didn't like Stewart, but he loved Sherman. So when he's going to start liking himself, he's going to start liking himself as Sherman. He could discard his like.
Is there anything that Sherman himself, Stewart himself has studied? I'm sorry, you're going to say something? Oh, I thought I would see your screen. Okay, what do we know about Stewart other than his great love for his cousin? He says he's not an A+ student. He's not an athlete. What does he have going for him?
He's a lump on the playground. There's no self-esteem here. The only thing is what Sherman has taught him.
Anything? Well, he's the kid who he shows up. He's the kind of the straight arrow, if you will, which could make him nerdy or dull compared to this wonderfully adventurous cousin he has. He tries to do his homework, studious. Sherman is one of the bright people who can instantly absorb knowledge and ace every test. And sometimes the rest, more people have to spend more time and with less flashy results. But Stewart doesn't give anybody any trouble. He reports to his mom, even when he's a teenager. He's afraid, we're going to get into big trouble. I'm out all night. Sherman patches it up. Sherman has the ready excuse. Stewart's pretty much a straight arrow. I'm going to stay home and study. Well, yeah, I would say that he's not totally gone, because I think at the very end, remember he shows. Well, he gave her the driver's license. My question is this: Sherman Cardwell Brownlee. That kind of confused me because Cardwell is Stewart's mother's name. So what?
Both of them. They're sisters.
So they would both have been Cardwells, yeah. So pretty much, that's a good point. Yeah, I had to think about, well, what else of Stewart's remaining? And all I can think of is, well, if he gets to class on time and stays out of trouble, then he's bringing the best of both brothers. He's bringing his own straight arrow approach with the energy, perhaps, the adventure, the courage that his cousin had. So it's an amalgam of roles. And it's a reinvention. I'm going to reinvent myself by assuming this identity.
Well, he's
It's kind of
probably, and in this new dual personality, if you will, he's probably not going to take the wild kind of risks that that Sherman would take, that resulted in Sherman's demise. He's going to, yeah, the best of both. Maybe that's what one could hope for.
That's actually the way I read it, that he's creating a new identity for himself, renaming himself, but it's an amalgam of the balance that he brings to this bright art, and hopefully we'll have a longer life. Well, should we go on to the last story? We go to Scotland. We go to Scotland in the mid-20th century with Abercrombie's aunt. Dan Webster, 1924, 1996. And she wrote, a Scottish writer, wrote about a dozen or so novels. The most famous is called Collier's Row, which is the beginning of a trilogy about a mining community and a family dynasty. And it's called the Kate trilogy because her strongest protagonist was a woman who had to make her way through this often closed.
I have my coffee.
Oh, yes. Okay, what about the very first line of the title, Abercrombie's aunt? Titles are interesting. And the very first line, people don't have aunts nowadays. Who says, what does she mean by that? How can you not have aunts?
I was really flummoxed because I read that and I thought, okay, whatever. And then the next paragraph, I had to read it twice because I just wasn't getting it. I thought, what's going on here? And it took me a little bit until I figured out. I still didn't know who Lulu was until much later. It just seemed, I don't know. Well, it was interesting, I'll say that.
Sorry about shoot. Got it now.
Well, the way I took it, and I also didn't, I kind of moved on because I didn't understand that second paragraph. The way I took the sentence was, it did ring a bell with me. It reminded me of something that somebody in my mother's family up in the country would say, meaning it used to be you had the family and the aunts would be important in the raising of the children, et cetera.
Yeah.
And is she talking about a change in society, culture?
Yeah, I think so. But you don't know that until way later.
Yeah, another mystery. Well, the way it's described from his point of view at first, and this is all the metaphor that the young Archie uses to describe it. What is this advancing toward me in sensible ferry boats and freshly cleaned circus tent if it isn't an ant? I think there's there's probably a stereotype if you read B.G. Wodehouse or anything. I think of ants in literature, often a maiden ant, I mean, it's a cliche, but the sister who doesn't get married, who lives with or near or is involved with the family. And an aunt can be a character. An aunt can be someone who either dotes on you or who conveniently dies and leaves you a fortune, or who is, in this case, always trying to keep you on the straight and narrow. And I just have a theory that these aunts, at least it seems to me in British literature, perhaps other literary traditions as well, they're a convenient way to satirize the older generation without sticking it to your mother. So someone in her generation who's close to you, but you wouldn't want to say that about your own mom, but an aunt, yeah, she's kind of there or not. So it takes a while because of the idioms that are used and some of the expressions that are Scottish. You've got to, it pieces his story together as you go along. So he's from the North Country, and he's going to the city to get a job with the BBC, but to be more sophisticated. And you get a sense too, well, do you maybe, about how Scots are viewed by English people. When he says he gets a job at BBC, he said he wants to present himself as being more sophisticated. And he doesn't want to assume the stereotype. I mean, it's ironic because he has the stereotypical notion of what an aunt is. And yet he himself realizes that for Scotland, he doesn't want to be these young professors in a tweed tie and red baron flying jacket discussing the dual nature of the northern race, as he saw it torn between nostalgia for the wee hoose among the heather and the need to dominate in the South. So, just anyone here of Scots heritage?
Way back, yes. But I don't think any of that came through that far.
Well, my father's side was Scots, and he would tell lots of jokes. For example, if someone from London had been told, if you told someone from London that you were mourning, you were recently bereaved, your father had passed away, the Londoner would express his sympathy and say, oh, that's terrible. If you mention that to your friend from Glasgow, the guy from Glasgow would say, what size shoes did he wear? Let that sink in. He doesn't need his shoes. You're giving away his stuff. The other Scots joke, and we always say you can tell jokes if they're all about your own ethnicity. He would say the Scotsman would go outside Christmas morning and shoot a gun and then go back in and say, oh, did you hear that? Santa Claus has just been shot. There won't be any presents this year. Anyway, all of this nonsense. So, how does Archie feel about his aunt? What is his how can I say? What is his image of the aunt, and what is his problem with his aunt coming to visit?
How soon is she leaving? He doesn't want her telling him he needs to get married. He needs to marry this Lulu. He doesn't want to hear it. Lulu's a little more open.
He doesn't want to hear, he doesn't want her to find out that he's sleeping with Lulu, and he's very uptight about the whole thing. So he's apprehensive beyond, you know.
And he also says he couldn't cope with two women.
Well, think about it, they're both very strong women, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. They're both very independent women. Yeah.
Mhm.
He could be caught in quite a situation, particularly if the strong woman that he's with doesn't get along with his auntie. However,
Well, you gotta love Lulu. I mean, good for her.
Mhm.
I think she sensed that the aunt was, she sensed that she could say it and it would work out, and sure enough, it did. But I gotta hand it to Lulu. She would be denying her authenticity if she did anything other than fess up.
Mhm.
very, very open, very strong. So the way the story was going, there's really two identity questions. Who is the aunt? And obviously, who is Archie? And the aunt finally identifies him. Were you surprised by that? She says, Archie, son. Archie, son. It's after she's been a little bit lubricated and she's been loosened up.
Ooh.
And Lulu has got her to talk. Yeah, Lulu gets her to talk, ask questions. What was it really like for you growing up? Was it really hard? Nobody's ever asked her about this. And she spills it all. I still don't know yet if Archie's put the pieces together. But Lulu
Oh.
had.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that he says, I just knew my mother died, and you brought me up.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend, I'll just diverge for 1 second. I had a friend who was from Scotland, and her mother had her illegitimately, and the Scottish society in town came down hard on them. Her mother was sent away, ended up going to Australia, and this woman was raised by her aunt. So there were some pretty draconian rules, it sounded like, in Scottish society.
And another similar aside, there's a woman in DC who's also from that background, young woman, and her mother was sent out into the country after she got pregnant as a single mom and was never able to get over it and somehow never connected with her daughter. I'm not sure exactly what happened. And eventually, you may want to read this book, wrote a book called My Affair with My Mother, because in order to reconnect with her mother, she would start meeting her mother at a hotel anonymously. The mother was so afraid of this societal norm of having born someone out of wedlock, and the way she was kind of cast aside as an outcast.
Oh, yeah.
Without it being revealed, but she was just sent off somewhere. And she could never get over it, even in her 60s.
How do you? Sarah, I think you had your hand up a moment ago.
I was thinking of the example right across the sea from Scotland of the Magdalen laundries, because these stories are very much an institution in Ireland, right? Where the young girls who got pregnant were put in these sort of mission houses and became indentured servants as while they had the kids. And I'm not sure that, I mean, the stories are always just heartbreaking. That's all, like, I mean, you hear different versions of it. But that whole Mary Magdalene, right? The Magdalen laundries thing that goes on in Ireland. I don't know, it doesn't still, I don't mean that, but I don't know how long it really was, because when you listen to Celtic music, you can still hear these songs coming. Ooh.
I remember it when the book came out. Yeah, if you come from a stringent society where this just was not tolerated, you're either sent away or you create a role play. Somehow she was able to keep her child, but whether she went to a different town, but then created this fiction to make it quote unquote respectable, also for the boy's sake, because had he been, he would have been labeled bastard, child out of wedlock. So she was sacrificing everything for this young man who really was influenced by her, but probably never realized the depth of the extent of that sacrifice. What about this hat? Oh, Ed, did you have your hand up? I thought you did.
Yeah, this really struck me because I had an aunt very much the same. And I think this Scotch-Irish thing that Sarah mentioned, this notion of shame, what will people think is a very common expression when somebody deviates from what's perceived as a norm. And maybe, the aunt was, I had an aunt that came to babysit when I was 2 and stayed for 50 years. So my father had 2 women that he lived with, and at any rate, and she became kind of a surrogate mother in many ways. And this is the case here, that she has this religious background that kind of forms her perceptions of the world and so on. And then I think Lola kind of began to challenge that, and she identified with what Lula was she admired Lula in a way, to the point where I think she came to accept that difference and liberated herself from that kind of ironclad religious what will people think background. Anyway, that was my take on it. I think it was well taken.
Yeah, I think so. In a very dramatic way. And anytime you're making a change this way, she was, I love the way it ends. There is just this reference to when they went to the tea center and they went shopping. And the aunt said, it's a different world we live in nowadays. If a woman had a bairn out of wedlock, she was branded a scarlet woman. Nowadays, all that thinking has changed. Her hand holding the teacup had trembled. This shaking, this is, I can say for her, a soul shaking event, ever so slightly though, as she appealed to Lulu, hasn't it? It has changed. It's not really the same, isn't it? And yes, Lulu responded, nowadays people are open. And after that, they'd gone and bought the hat. So sartorially, what's the sartorial symbolism? Why is this hat mentioned? Why would that be important in a little story like this?
I think it's a sign of celebration because didn't he say earlier that he was surprised that she didn't have a new hat when she arrived and at the train station? Because she always would buy a new hat. And for whatever reason, there was some transformation or some reevaluation of the value of this event. So she bought a hat.
It's celebratory. Yeah, you buy clothing celebratory. And what about this particular hat? Has no.
It's modern, very modern. It did not have a brim. It was a closed short, whatever.
Yeah, no brim, nothing to hide any part of your face.
Right.
She's so, yeah. So here's a story. Yeah, Annabelle?
It not in thought, not about the hat, but about her hand shaking on the teacup made me wonder, maybe she's really his mother and has, has built up this fiction that, well, your mother died, so I took you in.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I believe it. And I think we get that after Lulu has brought her out and given her some sherry, and oh, I won't have some. I don't really drink that much, a little bit. And then you find out she's drained a couple glasses or whatever it is that are drinking. And then she actually says somewhere, and this is after she's gotten a little bit hammered there. She says, Archie's son. She calls him.
Mhm.
And, well, maybe Archie lets that pass in the moment, but that and the handshaking, can you really come out? Has it really changed that much? I think that's the story. That's the mystery there. That's behind the mask, if you will. She can get rid of that. And Sarah.
And hence the first line from Lulu, right? The first line of the story. People
Mhm.
don't have aunts nowadays, right? Because you
Uh-huh.
no longer need this fiction about an aunt, right? Now your mother could be your mother regardless. So he doesn't really have an aunt.
I love it. Yeah, that's how it wraps up. We don't need ants anymore, at least not
Not those kind of
this
ants.
kind of ant. Uh-huh. Any other questions about this story or the other stories? Or the roles that we play?
Well,
A lot goes into it.
I see it
Yes,
here
Susan.
where she first gets the drink too. She's starting off by telling them about gossip about the town. Mini schooler, she had that shop. Well, she'd been seeing a married man every Wednesday, etc. So the stories about all the terrible thing, all the immoral people in town. She starts off with that, telling Lulu about people seeing married, men and stuff. And then Lulu says, well, what was it like for you growing up? I mean, this Lulu is
Owning it. Owning it.
She is a journalist. She does interviews too, and in her own job. So she has those professional skills of drawing people out, and she's applying them here in real life, which is great. They'll get along fine, and as long as Archie just goes along.
So think how long this, let's call it a secret. It is a secret if in fact, if she is the mother, how long she's repressed this secret and how wonderful it would have been had she been able to share that with the son. And so the lubrication and the coaxing of the interview helps release some of that pent up emotion where she's been holding this in for 30 years or whatever. So it's like a catharsis, a momentary catharsis, for her to let those words slip out. And then of course, I guess when she leaves, she's still, when you go through a moment like that, it's a transformative experience, but you still hold on to your original personality,
Yeah, this won't be an easy transition. Sarah?
I was going to say, they took us to the end and it's like they've closed it all down again. There was this, it's not clear who realizes what right here, right? It's not acknowledged.
Do you think Lulu knows?
People may know. Well, it's interesting because Lulu's the one of all of them that should it's not her lineage. She should be more honest. She's the one that's portrayed as being more straightforward and honest. But yeah, she just says nowadays people are open. There's no real coming to a place where they all acknowledge this, right?
Well, I think to address what Mario was saying, this is earth-shaking. This is a 36-year secret, because we learned that's how old Archie is. She's been repressing that. And it's going to be gradual, because Lulu says, we're going to come up and visit you real soon. And I think this is just opening the door a little bit of a crack, rather than flinging it open and showing the world. She's going to need time to adjust to this. It's a good thing, but that little tremble in her hand, am I really freed of this? Is this really gone? I see this as a very optimistic story. I see that this is happening. And Lulu, as it's Dodie, she's an extraordinary woman and a good person to help her. And I think it's coming out one way or another. It just doesn't happen fast. So, and perhaps it's better that Victor Grabert had a lifelong, what was it say, he was 49, 50 when he finally lost it all. He has had to repress his life to the point where it ended differently, drove him mad. This lady who has the love, at least she has her son, and she has this wonderful prospective daughter-in-law, or at least a person in her life. Better ending.
Definite parallel.
Yes, parallel, right.
Yeah, the pressures. Whereas in the other story, Walter Mosley, there's a little more freedom for this young man to choose and forge roles that he's going to have. And he chose them. He didn't have them imposed on him. So there's a big difference. Next week, we're going to read identity stories that have to do with not only how we view ourselves or what we pretend to be or how we name ourselves, but how other people see us. It's the image. It's sort of identity, but from the outside in rather than inside out. So there will be 3 stories about people going back to their roots, where they originally came from, and how that factors into who they are, who they think they are. Any other questions or comments?
Could I just? Yeah.
Yeah.
Could
Go
I just
ahead.
mention that? I'm sorry. Regarding interracial marriage and the strictures that have been put on by states, there's a great movie about what happened that you referred to earlier in the state of Virginia to get rid of the miscegenation laws. It's a movie probably based on a book called Loving. About
Oh yeah.
Great movie.
That was the name of the couple that that finally.
Yeah, wonderful name. Yeah. And as I said, that seems like it should be back, quote unquote, in the dark ages, but it's
That's relatively recent, like a couple of decades.
The 50s, maybe the 60s.
Yeah, well, it was anyway, 1967 when the Supreme Court struck down all of the miscegenation laws in the country.
But Virginia only took it off the books much more recently than that. That law was still on the books in Virginia. It may not have been enforced, but it was only gotten rid of, I think, in the last 2 decades.
Is that right? Yeah, well, that law had no teeth, obviously, since 67, but the fact that they didn't get around to getting it off the books is interesting. So we're all like to see more changes in that direction. And maybe less reason for people to assume roles and identities that they don't want. So whatever role or identity assume is your own creation, not imposed on you from the outside. Sarah.
I'm going to go quite lateral on that. on a sensitive topic because with the current issue is the LGBTQ and who you are and what your identity is and what your right to manifest, marry, inherit, all sorts of things would be, I think, today's translation of some of these questions.
Yes, they would. And I found a few short stories on that theme also. So if we had more than 3 weeks, I would trot them out and we'd see different
Next
challenges. to
semester.
it.
Let's
Next
just
term,
add a week.
Add a week,
Sure.
yeah.
I mean, I think this is a
Add a
topic.
week? Well, yeah, okay.
mean,
I think
This
I
is
take that
a
into
topic that so many of us are wrestling with, where I'll speak for myself, but where you want to understand and you want to continue the evolution toward, as Lulu would have said, sort of the openness, and yet it can be quite a challenge. I think it's something I know that I personally want to understand better.
how these things play out. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of what is today a sunny, beautiful fall day. It really does look like my backdrop out here, at least today. So a good day to go out, and if it were a little cooler, we might even kill off some of the mosquitoes. Thanks. Have a good day. Stay well, everybody. Stay safe.